Build One South Africa has called for the Trade, Industry and Competition Minister, Pox Dau, and the Small Business Development Minister, Stella Ndabeni-Abrahams, to present themselves before Parliament to explain the origins of the 500 million rand designated for a township and rural business development fund announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa on Friday. Now, the funding will be for the refurbishment of businesses and non-financial support in terms of technical skills, regulatory compliance and capacity building. BOSA leader Mmusi Maimane joins us for more. A very good evening to you, Mmusi. Thank you for your time. I mean, just looking at this, you've met the President's announcement to support township economies with some level of skepticism. Talk to us about your concerns.
Good evening, and good evening to fellow South Africans. I mean, the township economy is a fundamental backbone of South Africa, of South Africa's economy, and it's going to exist with us for the future. It's not only spaza shops, but it's also the different industries that are in townships, whether they are undertakers, catering businesses, welding, all sorts of furniture making businesses. There's a whole variety. In this particular instance, the first concern is when you are in the midterm framework and you ask for 500 million rands, this is money that has to come from multiple different programs. And therefore, the first part is that only Parliament, if it exceeds over 8% of a particular program, only Parliament is able to adjudicate for that. Because South Africa doesn't just have money lying around. All money is already allocated. In fact, we are running a debt. So ultimately, any money that is announced doesn't just fall out of a tree. It has to be taken from a particular program. The second issue is, ultimately, when this money comes into the economy, it's got to be ensured that these are not spaza shops or politically aligned ones, as we saw perhaps in some of the businesses that were taking place in Gauteng, where the government simply says it is refurbishing or assisting spaza shops. But what they really mean is they painted a spaza shop, and that's it. Or in certain instances, as we've seen in other reports, where there have been distribution centers that have been set up, and when you go to the DC center, none of that exists. So when we talk tangible support, let us make sure the money does eventually reach the intended beneficiary. The last thing we need is the repeat of what took place during COVID, where money is adjudicated, PPEs were needed, but we all know what happened to that money. We don't want the same to be happening to this one. So I welcome the initiative. I think it's important to fund the township economy, but I certainly think that we must make sure that all rands and cents don't become held up in politics, but end up empowering the entrepreneurs that who are desperately in need of support.
Yeah, I mean, I have spoken to those kind of entrepreneurs just a short while ago, but we'll touch on them just now. What is your take on the President's plan to re-register all spaza shops? I mean, he's given a 21-day deadline. What are your thoughts around that?
This is something that, for me, requires that we manage it in a way that A, is not discriminatory, B, is not cumbersome, because the existence of a spaza shop relative to another business is the fact that it does operate to some degree with a level of informality. And that's what makes those businesses work. For example, in a spaza shop, you can buy 3 slices of bread rather than a whole loaf of bread. Now, that makes a huge difference to someone who is poor, who can't afford a whole loaf of bread. Now, what you don't want to do is create restrictions, create confusion, and make sure that ultimately it becomes too difficult for people to register. Only spaza shops that are registered to politically connected people come through. And then furthermore, is another way of just trying to weed out which spaza shops are owned by which nationality in townships. Whereas I think if you make the issue to become about immigration, you sometimes can miss the point about saying, actually, what service do spaza shops provide? How do we regulate them, and how do we support them to make them more compliant, make sure more enabling in the South African economy?
Yeah, that's quite an important point, because a short while ago I spoke to 3 entrepreneurs operating in the township, and they spoke a great deal about creating these products locally, but having no room to put them, for instance, in a local spaza shop because of a lot of the criteria, or perhaps the willingness from the spaza shop owner. And we know that township enterprises have been described as that missing link needed to get South Africa onto a higher, more inclusive growth path. But looking at the share of the 500 million rand cash injection, maybe a dream come true for millions of small businesses. But the dream will be short-lived if nobody knows what metrics will be used to track the impact of the township economies and what measures will be put in place to prevent corruption. Because why do local entrepreneurs who make local products, why are they not able to put their products in local spaza shops?
And I mean, the lesson that South Africa needs to think through is look at other economies. So let's take a country like Thailand, or let's take, and it's shown in certain instances that the informal sector, where food is being prepared and sold to people, particularly to tourists, etc., is part of the way that generates that economy. Now, South Africa can't think of itself only as this formalized economy. It needs to be very considerate of the informal economy's needs and the fact that it is possible that when you are in township, you are able to buy, for example, food that is prepared locally and on site. That's how many of us grew up. We grew up in townships in that space, understanding that. So what's going to be important is to offer the support, make sure that where, for example, I would rather not only put that 500 million rands into pockets of particular entrepreneurs, but in some ways upgrading and refurbishment of where, for example, taxi ranks, where you find informal traders waiting there. But when you go to an informal trader, because as it so happens on the day, you feel like amakwenya, or you feel like cuisine that is prepared in the township, but you often find surrounding, there are no toilets, there are no places where you can wash hands, etc., etc. So the food may be prepared in a particular standard and way, but the ecosystem around it doesn't work. So let's rather upgrade the infrastructure around it so that these places don't become, whilst they may be informal, but don't become places where around them there's litter, there's no bathrooms, there's no sanitation, etc. It doesn't help the entire value chain. So to me, I think let's not think of entrepreneurs who are selling in an informal space as less than. Let's support them, because ultimately it's not just the township economy that we're looking at, it's a township from the economy. A t-shirt maker, a person who is making mohodu or whatever the food that, for example, you might want to be able to consume from the township to other sectors must be made possible through that system. And I would urge that what government must be thinking is not just making a piecemeal intervention in what is a crisis around children dying, which for all of us as South Africans should be something that sears up, that forces us to rethink what we're doing. But in that process, let us make sure we stimulate an economy that is sustainable, that will be able to employ more people and ensure that the products that you are describing that come from townships and food that comes from township is able to be not only consumed in townships healthily, but exported from the township to other places.
Yeah. We've heard a lot of small businesses complain about the red tape in accessing funds. I mean, it's all well and good to have 500 million rand that is meant to be benefiting small businesses in townships and rural areas, but there are many tiers when it comes to who qualifies, who's eligible. The question of fairness and inclusivity will be imperative, won't it?
Of course, and that's why I would hope that we also establish an independent regulatory format body that is able to ensure that it is a partnership between entrepreneurs themselves and aspects of government. I would have preferred that not only the president announced a 500 million rands fund, because it sounds a lot of money, but it isn't in some instances, because the township economy, I can take a community like Mamelodi, at which its annual business turnover is over 2 billion rand. So when you just take one aspect, you realize that 500 million rands is not a lot of money, but wouldn't it be great for us to be able to say, let us, if government puts up 1 rand, let the private sector also put up 1 rand, so that we were talking 1 billion rand, that we could be able to say, not only is it for the upgrading on infrastructure, but it's also a way of making sure that businesses that are started up, that are getting to a place where they are mid-level. For example, some of the eating places, they may have been established, but they need additional capital injection to go to the next level, so that when tourists arrive and they want to go to the township, they can eat at various different places, as we saw some of what's been happening in streets like Vilagazi and many others. But what I think the long-term issue here that we've got to achieve is to say the metrics must be of development, of making sure jobs are created, but they cannot be political. The last place we need is to have another hair salon funding program that the Gauteng government introduced in the last administration, where when you arrive at these hair salons, money is being deployed and millions of rand, but you can see that those businesses aren't going to grow to the next level.
Yeah.
That is not the sort of practice we need.
Very well. Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. Build One South Africa leader Mmusi Maimane. Thank you for your time.